Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to another episode of New Music Finds, where I like to collect together all the different things that I've purchased over the past week. I get them from different places, my local record store, but also online retail like Amazon, eBay, and more. I've got 20 things to run through with you, 18 CDs, 2 records. We'll get into that here in just a bit, but before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also, leave a comment, hit like. All those things are helpful to my channel. I greatly appreciate it. And of course, if you turn on notifications, you'll never miss an episode. You're going to stay up to date on everything that's coming out through this channel. And of course, lots and lots of cool stuff to come. So you want to be in the know on all of that. But here we are today. We were talking about some of the new things that I just got, hopefully sparking some new ideas for you guys. First one up, we're starting with some new releases here, is the brand new Bon Jovi album, 16 studio album called Forever, just came out this past Friday. And I have done a full review for this thing. So if you want to hear me like fully get into it, check the link in the description below. But this album is very different than anything that the band has done. And I'm enjoying it, but it hasn't really kicked off for me just yet. There are certainly some standout tracks on here, but I'm curious to see if this album is really going to grow on me, or in time after the newness wears off of it, whether or not I'll feel any different one way or the other. Um, the difference in terms of its sound is actually more of a musical thing than it is John Bon Jovi's vocals, although those are a little different as well. But then his vocals have been changing for some time. If you've been a fan of the band for the 40 plus years, then you've heard those changes happening since the early 2000s. And if you've listened to the last couple of records, then you've also heard what he already is. And so I don't think there's any big, great revelation in what this album is and how it's different than those. It's just that for those people that keep thinking there's going to be a return to form album from the 80s or something, so they only ever check it out briefly at the time when a new album drops, but they never purchase, they never listen, they never really follow along. Those people are shocked when they hear what Bon Jovi sounds like today. But this is not a big difference from the last few albums. It's just a continued progression for the band. It is Bon Jovi 2024. I, for one, am glad they are forever. I'm glad they put this album out. And I'm going to continue to buy their stuff and enjoy it. I like it. I like it for what it is. And if you've been a longtime fan of theirs, definitely check it out. If you think you're going to suddenly hear something from the 1980s, probably best if you just skip it. But anyway, brand new Bon Jovi came out, and I, for one, am happy. This one here ended up being the one that really clicked with me. Grand Slam Wheel of Fortune. If you're not familiar with this band, it goes all the way back to the mid 80s, where Phil Lynott, after having broken up Thin Lizzy, formed this group. And at the time when first started, it had some guys from Thin Lizzy in it, but ultimately those guys were out of the band by the time they were touring and doing anything. And they recorded stuff in the studio, but never released an album. They weren't able to get a record deal at the time. And unfortunately, about a year after the band had formed and played and things like that, Phil Lynott passed away. And so there never was to be an album with him on vocals. Since that time, different studio sessions or demos or things of that nature have been released, and you can get a hold of Phil Lynott fronted Grand Slam. The band reformed a number of years back, I don't know, maybe around 2018, give or take, and they put out an album in 2019, their first official album that was half new and half re-recordings of songs that they had done back in 1985. So they have a new vocalist. The lead guitar player, and at the time on that first album, Mark Stanway, the keyboardist, was also there. He's not part of this new one here. We just have Lawrence Archer, the original guitar player, still with this lineup. But it's sort of like Black Star Riders, where that was Scott Gorham, another guitar player in Thin Lizzy, continuing on his version of Thin Lizzy, but ultimately deciding not to record under the name, so he changed the name to Black Star Riders, but for all intents and purposes, it was Thin Lizzy. And if you liked that band and you can get behind that, then you should be able to get behind this, because it just sounds like fantastic Thin Lizzy style music that's made by somebody else. It's made by a group called Grand Slam. And second official album, but I really, really dig it. And this was one that I only found out while putting together the what just dropped series for you guys, the episode, most recent one for you. And it's a group called Hitten. And the album itself called Twist of Fate. This is actually a reissue. I think this album is a 2018 release. It was the third studio album, and it is done by High Roller Records, who does these cool slipcase things on the albums when they put them back out. But I just saw that album cover and I said, I got to check out who these guys are. High Roller Records is also known as being one of those labels that reissues lost or very obscure metal albums from the 80s. So I thought this was that until I read up on it and I found out, no, actually it's one of the newer wave of traditional heavy metal bands called Hitten. And I'm not sure exactly where they're from. I want to say maybe they're a German band or something, but reissue of their third studio album, they're still very much out there making albums. You can get other albums, but I checked this one out and it was so good. Can't believe how good this album is. It's definitely right in the vein of, 80s era Judas Priest, 80s era, Queensryche, kind of maybe a mashup of those two. Vocalist kind of has a bit of a feel of Jeff Tate when he sings, but I really enjoyed this album. If you're looking for a newer modern day band that sounds like classic 80s metal, this group Hitten would be one to check out. So those are three things that I picked up that were new, but of course, always digging into older stuff, always at my local record stores, seeing what kind of cool finds I can do. And last week, I showed you guys an album by Michael Voss, who did a tribute to Status Quo, or more specifically, Rick Parfitt, the guitar player. And I mentioned that I had picked that up because, one, I'm a fan of Michael Voss and I like what he does. But I sort of saw that and said, well, gee, maybe this is my opportunity to get turned on to some Status Quo stuff, because I've never really followed them before and I didn't know anything by them. And people have been telling me forever to get into Status Quo, but every time I check out an album, it just doesn't really do anything for me. And I put on the Michael Voss album, and first track up, Again and Again, I knew. And I later found out why I knew it. And it wasn't from Status Quo. It was because Great White had done a cover of it on an album called Recover that they did in the 90s. They did a covers album. And that was, I think, the second song on there. And I didn't know that that was a Status Quo song. I just associated it with Great White, although I knew it was a cover, but I associated it there. And so I started to hear the Status Quo sound as an extension of Great White, who I happen to really like, that blues rock sound. And suddenly I was able to appreciate Status Quo the way I never had before. So I picked up this, a 5-album collection, starting in 1972 with Pile Driver and coming all the way up to this one here, which is Blue for You, I think 1977. So getting those 5 albums, in the cardboard sleeve thing like this, which is always kind of cool when you can spend $20 and get 5 albums like this. Very cool. So I got that, and I did enjoy this, but I have to say this didn't initially move me. And what I was looking for still was the album that had the song Again and Again. I wanted to hear that album because I liked that song, and maybe the rest of the album that would sound like that. And so I looked up and I found out that it was called If You Can't Stand the Heat. And I found this one at my local record store, Sound Exchange. Always good to, for finding out of print albums like these. So they had this one here, and this was exactly what I was looking for. The entire album was that kind of blues hard rock that I really enjoyed. So I love that. And while I was there, I also picked up this one here, Whatever You Want, which is from 79. So 1978. And I said, you know what? I've already got the 77 album, the one that came before this. Let me get the album that comes right after this, and this one too. So these two together, both of these turned out to be absolutely fantastic. This one here, 2 of the songs on here, Again and Again and Oh What a Night, were both songs that were on that tribute album. And this one here had the song Living on an Island. That was on there. So when I listened to these albums, I felt like I was hearing radio hits because I'd already become attuned to them, having listened to the Michael Voss album. So in the end of the day, that Michael Voss album did exactly what I had wanted it to do, which is to get me to know status quo songs so that when I listen to the album, I don't feel completely lost in them. There would be some stuff that would stand out. I also decided to go ahead and pick up something that was newer, and I picked up In Search of the Fourth Chord. I think this was a 2007 release originally. This one that I have in my hand, I think, is a later reissue of it. But I checked this one out while I was standing there in the store, with my headphones and stuff, and it just grabbed me too. And I just said, wow, geez, this is a great one. So regardless of looking for that era, and I tend to want to listen to classic era albums before getting into newer stuff by bands. But yeah, I went ahead and picked that up too. So in the end of the day, I ended up with 8 status quo albums this past week, building an instant collection going from 0 status quo to 8, plus a tribute album, so really 9 albums. And this is one I'd actually had, sold, regretted it, wish I still had it, found a used copy of it, so I was adding it back to the collection. Ronnie Wood live album called Slide On Live, Plugged In and Standing. This was back, I think, in around 92, 93 when the MTV Unplugged was so popular, so I'm sure that's why it was called Plugged In and Standing instead of the idea of unplugged and seated, which I think might have actually been the name of the Rod Stewart album. Can't remember, but I know he did an Unplugged album that Ronnie Wood was part of, and maybe that's why this was called that. Anyway, the reason I picked this up is not so much for Ronnie Wood solo stuff, except that he has Bernard Fowler, backup vocalist for the Rolling Stones, singing lead. And I really like him. I've gotten into him a lot more since he became the lead vocalist with the most recent George Lynch and Jeff Pilson album of covers. I was totally blown away by his vocals and then wanted to go gather up anything that he had done and found out he had sung live in concert for Ronnie Wood, and so definitely wanted that. So I had one live album that he was on already, but knew that there was a second one and wanted that in the collection. All right. In the last few weeks or so, I've been picking up some different albums that are part of the No Speak label. And this is a label that does not necessarily guitar, but definitely instrumental albums. That's why it's called No Speak. So instrumental albums, but does heavily focus on guitar. And so I picked up a second compilation album called Guitar Speak, and it's on the No Speak label. And it's got killer artists on here. And the first one on here is Tony Iommi, and then it goes into Jan Ackerman from Focus. A bunch of other guitars on here I'm not too familiar with, but Frank Marino of Mahogany Rush is also on here, and Ronnie Montrose is on here. So very cool. Loved that sound, just like what they were doing. These are like 87, 88 era, so very well produced, glossy 80s sounding stuff. And then found another one that I was interested in picking up, Pete Haycock. Not familiar with who he is, whether he's anyone famous or not, but I checked out this album, really liked it, so I bought a used copy of that. So filling in, I've now got 6 albums from the No Speak. Incidentally, the Pete Haycock is the first one. This Guitar Speak is number 10 in the series, so it's interesting. They actually have a number on the front of them to tell you, and I don't necessarily need to get them all, but I am interested in getting the bulk of them. There's a few I've listened to that aren't really my cup of tea. The William Orbit albums, and there's one from Stuart Copeland that sounds more like a movie score than it does actual, instrumental music that I might be interested in. But I've, if I come across some used, I'll probably pick them up just to have them, but I'm not going to shell out big bucks for them. Okay, so getting into gearing up for the new Deep Purple album that has a new guitar player, Simon McBride, and Simon McBride, part of the Don Airey band, Don Airey being the keyboardist in Deep Purple currently. The vocalist in the Don Airey band is Carl Sentence. Carl Sentence having come from Persian Risk, but gearing up listening to the Don Airey band with Carl Sentence singing made me want some more Carl Sentence stuff, and I found that he was the lead vocalist on Dario Molo's Crossbones. And since Dario Molo being someone who's partnered up with Tony Martin from Black Sabbath, and with Black Sabbath released last week, I was into both Dario Molo related stuff through the Tony Martin and Carl Sentence related through the Deep Purple that collided together in one album. And I thought that was very cool. It was just absolutely what I needed at that moment, finding a band that had two guys I was currently listening to doing something together, and this album turned out to be really fantastic. On the Frontiers Records label, Dario Molo being an Italian guitar player, Frontiers Records being an Italian label, so it makes total sense, but because Carl Sentence was in it, definitely interested in that. And last week I picked up an album by the band Heat, and it was called Force Majeure, I think. And I found that they put this out called Extra Force, which had two songs, new songs or unreleased songs from those sessions, two songs that were re-recorded by the original vocalist, redoing ones that Eric Gronwall had done when he sang for the band before leaving for Skid Row, plus a bunch of live songs. So I picked this up because I really, really enjoyed that Heat album that I got. And this was an album that just popped up while I was streaming music. The band ended, and it was Helicopters. And so that has Nikki Anderson in the group. And all of a sudden, this group, Imperial State Electric, popped up, including this album here, All Through the Night. And I was like, who is this? What is this? And the song itself was a little bit more poppy than I might have expected, but it was catchy, and that's why it made me take out my phone and look at it. And I was just sort of like, oh, that was interesting. This has that look of the Warner Brothers, old logos and things like that. And so I did a quick search on it, and I found out that this band was what Nikki Anderson put together after the Helicopters when he was going to do a solo thing, but ended up creating a band instead. And I had no idea that he had done something in between the first time of the Helicopters and the second time of the Helicopters, other than Lucifer. But he's a drummer in that lineup. And when I found this, it was great. It was like, oh, I can go buy 4 more albums from a singer and guitar player who I really, really dig that I didn't know had other stuff out there. So that was a really cool find this past week. And then this one, Traitor, which is on the Lost Realm Records and is one of those throwback metal albums from the early 80s. And this is a demo 5-song EP that a band put out that never did anything beyond that. So they just have the original demo mix and then a remix of those same songs. So 10 tracks, but 5 of them repeat on it. And I had seen this when I was at the record store last week making all those metal purchases that I did from Music Connection, but I didn't pick it up. And it was one of those ones that afterwards I kind of kept thinking about, saying, I really should have gotten it. These things don't stick around very long, and when they do come out, you got to jump on them. And I'm I don't know, I love getting that old school rare metal album, especially where it's done properly released today. So I had to add that into the collection. It wasn't very much anyways, so I wanted to get it. And it's just actually got grouped with those things from the previous week because that's what I associate it with, but I purchased it a little more recently. And then I picked up 2 records. Flash, I don't know which album, if this is the 3rd or if this is the 4th or something, but I know it's not the first 2. So Peter Banks, guitar player for Yes, going out doing this project after Yes, and really enjoying this release here. I've got the first 2 albums that they did, and then this one here, don't know if it's been available on CD, probably is, just not currently. But yeah, saw this one. It was $4.99 in good condition, so I said, why not? I'll add it to the collection until I find a CD copy. And this one, which is really hard to find on CD and goes for an astronomical amount of money, has been reissued on vinyl. Fanny, and I was showing you guys this one in one of the recent videos that I filmed for the Sound Exchange sessions with Anthony, but all-girl 1970s era band, this album 1971 Charity Ball, and they had put out a live album recently that I talked about in the What Just Dropped series that I did for this past Friday, and so they were on my mind. So when I went to Sound Exchange, I asked Anthony, and he said, well, you're never going to find it on CD, but they just reissued this one on vinyl. So I added, and he was raving about the band, and it's sort of like an early version of Fleetwood Mac. the way that the female vocals and the band sounds. They're definitely a rock band. A little bit more soulful maybe than Fleetwood Mac sounds. But I like it. It was good stuff. I'm glad to have it. I'm gonna, dive into it a bit more. And I did find out that I think the fourth album has been reissued on CD and is readily available along with that new live album. So if I get deep enough into the band, I'll check out some more stuff. And Anthony knows to try to keep an eye out for the debut album on CD for me, which I would like to get a hold of. That's what I went in for. He did not have a copy on vinyl either, so I picked up the second one, but that's okay. I actually really like the song Charity Ball. That was the one that stood out to me anyways, and that's on here, so it worked out all in all. And there you go. Those are the 20 things I picked up this past week. Quite a bit of different style stuff across the board. I love doing that. I'm never just in one musical style, and I buy based on just things that excite me, that interest me. So I will go to a record store with something in mind, like the status quo. But if there's other stuff that I find while I'm there, I never pass it up just because I'm not in the mood for something. I will buy it and listen to it. And if it doesn't move me, I put it aside and I come back to it later if the time is right and let it move me then. But anyways, there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I hope it turned you on to some new things, or at least gave you some ideas about stuff to go grab out of your own collection. So go enjoy that stuff, and I'll be talking to you real soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.